Welcome to this class on the financial coverage, part 2, debt and equity financing. So as we know from the previous class, a project is typically funded using equity that confers ownership rights and debt that instead involve borrowing from banks and other investors. Therefore, in this class, we'll first analyze debt financing, main characteristics of this form of financing. Then equity financing and its main characteristics. And finally, we'll have a comparison of debt versus equity financing in terms of implication for the project and different characteristics of these two forms of financing for the investors. So let's start from debt financing, main characteristics. So when we negotiate a debt for the financing of a project, there are some specific issues that have to be defined. First of all, and as we can expect, the interest rate that is paid to the bank. And as we have already explained in the last class, this interest can be fixed or can be floating. In this second case, if we have a floating interest rate, this is linked to a given standard, and the interest rate clearly is a cost for the firm, and instead is a form of return for the bank or the investor. Another interesting issue that we'll analyze in this class is that the interest is typically deductible cost for the firm. This means that it reduces taxation. And so this is an implication, as we'll also see in the next class, for the real cost of capital that the firm has to sustain for this project. Then we have service charges. So service charges are all these the other charges that the bank requires for a given financing and relate to the services that the bank is offering to the firm and the cost for arranging and managing the loan. Then we have the disbursement schedule. So typically the loan is immediately disbursed at the beginning of the project. So when there is investment need, the firm is able to immediately get the amount promised by the bank. In other cases, the disbursement can be delayed and can be linked to some specific milestone of the project, or just can be negotiated on the basis of specific cash flow requirements for the project. And then we have two aspects that will be the object of detailed analysis in this class. The issues are the amortization, and the amortization is basically the repayment schedule of the debt by the firm. So it's about the timing of the repayments that go from the firm to the bank. And then we have the grace period. The grace period is an eventual postponement of the principal payment of a debt. And then we'll see what exactly is a grace period, what are its implications, and in which cases typically firms and banks negotiate a grace period for a given loan. So let's start from the amortization of debt. So when we talk about the amortization of debt, we have to remember that once that the firms gets a loan from a bank, it is clear to repay the loan to the bank. And this will be done in periodic payments. So you will have a given schedule for repayments. You can have monthly, quarterly, or annual payments. And the periodic payment that the firm is going to make to the bank is made of two different components. In fact, you have the principal payment and the interest payment. So the principal payment is basically referred to the initial amount of debt that the bank has made available to the firm, whereas the interest payment is the cost that the firm is paying for having access to this loan. And we'll see that we have different kind of amortization schemes for debt that involves different types of principal in the interest payments. In particular, as we can observe in these slides, in the amortization of debt, we have three main schemes. The constant principal, the annuity, and negotiated profile. So what is the constant principal? So in the case of constant principal, the total amount of debt is divided by the number of installments that are contractualized, and therefore you have constant principal payment for each of the period that are contractually determined. On the other side, you pay interest. Interest is added, therefore, to these principal payments and is calculated on the unpaid loan balance. So in this case, you first have the definition of the constant principal, and then you add the interest payment calculated on the basis of the interest rate and the unpaid loan balance. In the case of annuity, we have a different scheme because here the total debt and interest is paid in equal installments over the life of the project. So in this case, clearly being the installments equal across time, we'll have a different proportion in the different moments of the life of the loan between between principal and interest. And finally, we have a negotiated profile that is a profile where the repayment schedule is defined on the basis of the financing need of the project, and so it's not following a particular scheme. So for the constant principal and annuity, now we'll see some formulas and numerical examples that will make clearer how these amortization schemes work. Let's start from the constant principal scheme. So in this case, what we do first is to calculate the principal payment that will be constant over the life of the loan. And the principal payment is calculated by dividing the initial loan balance, that is B0, by the number of installments that are determined from the contracts. So as we'll see, the principal payment will be equal to P equal B0 divided by N. And this will be the constant principal payment in all the periods of the loan. And then once that we're calculating in the first step the principal payment, then we add the interest payment, where the interest payment is calculated as the product of the interest rate and the loan balance at the year before the interest is charged. So let's make a simple example that allows us to understand better how the constant principal scheme works. So here in the upper part of the slides, we find the main assumptions. So let's assume that we have an initial loan balance of 5,000, the daily payments are 5, and that the interest rate is 10%. So in the table that is here, on the first column, we have the years of the life of the loan. Then we have the initial loan balance at the beginning of the period. Then we have the periodic payment, that is the sum of principal and the interest payment. Okay, so here we start from year 0. In year 0, we are getting the loan of 5,000. And then what happens after 1 year? In 1 year, we'll pay the first principal. As you can see here, the principal is calculated by dividing the initial loan balance of 5,000 by the number of payments that are 5. So as we can see here in this column, we have 5 principal payments, each of 1,000. So this is just an application of the formula we saw in the slide before. So what happens here is that once that we calculated the principal at the year 1, we have also to calculate the interest payment. So how is the interest payment calculated? Well, we just apply the 10% interest rate to the loan balance at the year before. So in this case, we have an interest that is the 10% of 5,000, so it's 500. So the total periodic payment required in year 1 is 1,500, where 1,000 is the principal payment and 500 is the interest payment. So as you can see, we first calculate the principal payment, then we calculate the interest payment, and then we calculate the periodic payment as a sum of principal and interest. So let's see what happens in year 2 so that the example is even more clear. So in year 2 we have again a principal payment of 1,000 that is constant for the 5 years, and this time the interest rate is calculated by applying the 10% interest rate on the loan balance in the year before, and this we can see in this table. The loan balance in the year before, that is year 1, is 4,000. So the 10% or 4,000 is 400. So in year 2 the interest payment will be lower because from year 0 to year 1 the loan balance has decreased. So again, if we want to calculate the total periodic payment, we sum up the principal and the interest payment. So we sum up 1,400 and we get a periodic payment of 1,400. So at this point you understand that when we go to year 3, we have again a principal of 1,000. In this case the interest rate is calculated by multiplying the 10% interest rate times the loan balance at the end of year 2. So the interest rate will be 300 and the periodic payment will be 1,300. So when we arrive at the end of year 5, you will have loan balance of 0 because each year the principal payment has reduced the loan balance. So as we have 5 payments of 1,000, going from year 0 to year 5, you have 5 principal payments of 1,000, so you will completely repay the initial loan balance of 5,000. In fact, in this example, in the last year, the loan balance is equal to 0. So the loan has been completely repaid. The dynamics of the periodic payment and of the interest and principal payment is clearly represented in this graph. So here we can see that the blue part of the column is referred to principal payment. The pink part of the column is referred to the interest payment. So as you can see from this graph, for all the 5 payments, the principal payment is constant, whereas as we saw from the previous table, the interest payment decreases over time. So this amortization scheme implies that the total periodic payment is not constant, but decreases over time as interest charges decreases over time. So let's look now instead at the annuity scheme of amortization. So in this case, the difference is that we have not a constant principal payment, but we have a constant periodic payment. So it's the total payment that the firm makes a bank each year that is constant. So this means clearly, as we'll see in a moment, that instead the principal payment and the interest payment will change, but their sum will be the same in all the years of the project. So in this case, in order to understand how debt repaid, the first thing that we have to do is calculating the periodic payment, so the total periodic payment, including both principal and interest. So in this case, the total periodic payment is calculated according to this formula. So the formula is as follows. So the periodic payment is equal to B0, that is the initial loan balance, multiplied 1 over R, where R is the interest rate, times parentheses 1 minus 1 divided times 1 plus R, where R is again the interest rate, at the power of n, where n is the number of payments that is required by this loan. So the first step is therefore calculating the periodic payment required by the loan in each period, and then you calculate separately the interest payment and the principal payment. In particular, the second step is to calculate the interest payment, and the interest payment is calculated again by multiplying the interest rate times the loan balance at the year before, as we saw also for the cost and principal scheme. Instead, the principal payment in this case is calculated as the difference between the periodic payment that has been calculated in the previous slide and the interest payment that has been just calculated. So in this case, the principal payment is residually calculated based on the calculation of the periodic payment and interest payment. So now with another example, we'll clarify this scheme of debt amortization. Again, we are assuming that we have five yearly payments for an initial loan balance of 5,000 and for an interest rate of 10%. So here again, we have the number of years of the life of the loan. And here the loan balance, the total periodic payment, the principal payment, and interest payment. So in this case, the first step is calculating the periodic payment using the formula that we saw before. So using that formula, we find that the total periodic payment, including both principal and interest payment, is equal to 1,319. And this is constant over time. So in all the installments are equal during the life of the loan. Then, after this first step, we are going to calculate the interest on the loan balance. So at year 1, we refer to the loan balance at year 0. And so in this case, the interest payment is equal to 10% of interest rate times 5,000 of loan balance. So we have a total interest payment at year 1 of 500. And at this point, we have both calculated the periodic payment and the interest payment. We can residually calculate the principal payment, as we know that the sum of these two is to be equal to the periodic payment. So in this case, the principal payment will be equal to the total periodic payment of 1,319 and the interest payment of 500. So the result is that at year 1, the principal payment is 819. So then we pass to year 2. Year 2, we have again the same periodic payment as explained before. In this case, what we can see at year 1 is that the loan balance has decreased of 819, that is the principal. So now the interest payment is calculated on a lower loan balance. So the interest rate will be the 10% of 4,181, and so will be 418. As the periodic payment is always the same, now the principal payment is calculated as the difference between periodic payment and interest payment. So the final result for the principal payment is 901. And again, from year 1 to year 2, the loan balance is reduced accordingly to the principal payment. So the loan balance passes from 4,181 to 3,280 because it has been decreased of 901 that was principal payment in year 2. So using the same procedure, we go to year 0. Again, what we find is that in year 0, the loan balance has been completely amortized. There is no remaining or unpaid loan balance. And clearly, as we go from year 0 to year 5, while the periodic payment remains constant, the principal increases and the interest decreases as a consequence of the procedural amortization that we have just described. And again, in order to have a clearer picture of how this amortization scheme works, we can look at this graph that provides an example of an annuity again. So as we can see here, the columns are all equal. This is because the total payment per period is constant, so this is not changing. What is changing, as we can clearly see from the blue part and the pink part of this graph, is the proportion between interest and principal. Because as time passes, the loan balance decreases and the interest payment decreases. So given the total installment, the principal will increase. And this is very clearly represented in this picture. Finally, we have the last type of amortization scheme that had been defined before as negotiated profile. So in this case, the amortization is not following a specific rule, but is personalized for the specific project, and depends basically on the cash flow generated by the project, in the sense that a given project can have a financing needs that changes over time. In particular, a project can require more financing at the beginning and then produce cash flow after a given year. So a negotiated profile can reflect this schedule of cash flows and therefore, for example, require no payment or low payment at the beginning of the life of the loan and then increase the payment at a lower time. Because it's clearly interest of both the firm and the bank that the firm is able to pay the contractualized payments for this loan, and therefore it's better for both parties to negotiate a repayment schedule that is concordant with the expected cash flows from this project. So another contractual issue that can be considered in order to solve the problem about the cash flow constraints of the project is the grace period. The grace periods basically consist in a postponement of the principal payment. So this means that the loan is disbursed immediately, but the firm is going to pay the principal only starting from a given year in the life of the project. So you basically postpone the principal payment. The reason why you can agree this kind of contractual clause is because, again, cash flow generated by the project could not be enough in some periods, above at the beginning, to repay the principal. So this happens, for example, when you have an infrastructure project, again, where you have a construction phase, then followed by the operation phase. If the construction lasts 3 years, in the last 3 years the project is not generating any cash flow, and therefore it will be not possible for the firm to repay the principal. So again, this is another contractual clause that can be used as a negotiated profile in order to look for an alignment between the cash flows generated by the project and the payment that the firm has to make to the bank. As concerns the interest payment in the grace period, you can have other solutions that makes the situation even easier for the firm. For example, if you have a construction phase, it can happen that the interest that you should pay on the loan balance during the construction phase is not paid in that period. But one solution could be to capitalize the interest payment and so transforming that into principal, then after that will be paid in the moment the firm will be able to generate cash flow, so typically during the operations phase. Or it can happen that the interest is then postponed to the operating phase as described in this slide. So this was about the debt financing. Now we have the other main source of financing for a project, that is equity financing. So here we look at the main characteristics of equity financing as we've already done for debt financing. So here in this slide we report the main characteristics of equity financing. First of all, what matters in defining equity financing is that equity confers an ownership right. So it's not, does not imply borrowing. Who is investing as an equity holder in the project or in the firm is basically becoming a owner of the firm. So as we'll see in a moment, this will have a set of consequences for the equity as form of financing. As owner, first of all, the equity holder has a residual claim on the profits. So what does it mean? It means that once that the firm has paid all the costs for a project, the residual profits that are what remains after that firm has paid all the costs is a profit that accrue to the equity holder. So the equity holder is a claim on these profits. However, even though the project has generated a profit, the equity owner is not necessarily a right to be remunerated, because once that a project has generated a profit, the firm can decide to pay or not dividends. So dividends are the payment that the firm makes to the equity holders if it has generated profits. So it can happen that, for example, in a given year, the project has generated $1 million of profits, but the firm prefers to reinvest this money for other activities, and so it's not going to pay dividends. So even though the equity holder has a residual claim on profits, it is not necessarily right to remuneration through dividends. So dividends is anyhow a discretionary decision that the firm can make, even though the project of the firm as a whole is obtained profit in a given period. Again, another consequence of being owners and not creditors is that there is no assurance or redemption. So what does it mean? That when you are investing your money as equity holder in a project or a firm, there is no guarantee that your money will be paid back. So if for example, a firm should lose all the money, there is no contractual obligation to redeem your initial investment. So as equity holders, you are basically assume the risk of the firm and its activities, and that's why equity financing is also often defined as risk capital, because it's a capital that involves a risk of the business for who is investing the money. And finally, as we have already discussed in the previous class, we can have different types of equity financing. We have explained why they are different. So what matters in this specific case is that the fact that there is no obligation of remuneration to the equity holder is always true for ordinary shares. So in this case, even the firm is realized the profit has no obligation of paying dividends. This is not true instead for preferred shares, where we have seen that the firm is the obligation to pay a minimum dividends. So in this case, the risk and the return profile is different. Also considering that preferred shares also confer a priority to the equity holders on redemption in case of bankruptcy of the firm. So now that we have analyzed the main characteristics of debt and equity, we have looked at different amortization schemes of debt, and we have looked at the main characteristics of equity, we can compare the two sources of financing. So we'll analyze what are the characteristics of debt versus equity financing. And in doing that, this is, by the way, the last issue of this class, we'll also understand why equity and debt plays a different roles in the financial structure of the firm, and why they have a different impact on the cost of capital of the firm. That is an issue that we'll discuss then in greater detail in the next class. So here in this slide, we have a table that presents in a synthetic way the main differences between debt and equity as form of financing, and this information are clearly relevant for the project sponsor to understand how to make the decision about debt and equity when they have to look for the financial resources for a project. So the first characteristics that we can take into consideration is service. So in the case of debt, the service is determined. So we have seen that there is typically an amortization scheme. You can have different amortization schemes, but these are typically contractually defined. So when you are a creditor, you typically know how the service of debt is made in the future. So you know when the principal will be paid, when the interest will be paid, and so on. So in the case of equity instead, as we saw that there is no guarantee of redemption and there is no guarantee on the payment of dividends, the service of the equity is uncertain and will depend on the ability of the firm to make profits, but also on the discretionary decisions that firms can make at any time about dividend payments. So in the case of service preference, clearly debt is preferred. So this means that equity holders cannot pay dividends to themselves until the firm is served correctly debt, so it's paid principal and interest to the creditors. So in this sense, creditors have a preference on the services of their investment. Then there is a difference also on the claim on profits, in the sense that equity holders do have a claim on profits, whereas debt holders have not a claim on profits. This is because the creditors have typically a fixed form of remuneration, that is the interest rate, and the interest rate is contractually determined, is certain, and it does not depend on the profits of the firm. So they have different kind of remuneration, whereas the equity holder have an uncertain type of remuneration that depends on the profits that the project is going to generate in its life. As we were discussing before, moreover, redemption is mandatory for debt, so it's mandatory for the firm, given the contract that is subscribed, to repay the principal back to the creditors, whereas the redemption of the equity investment is uncertain because it's not mandatory. So there is no particular obligation, as we were saying, for a firm to pay back the investment made by equity holders. Then there is liquidation preference for debt holders that is not present for equity holders. So what does it mean? It means that in the case of bankruptcy, the available resources will be first used to pay back the creditors, that they therefore a preference, and then only if there are remaining resources, the equity holders will be satisfied pro quota, but they cannot be redeemed until the debt holders have been completely satisfied in their credits. So also in the case of bankruptcy, debt is less risky than equity. And then the last point is claim on net worth. So net worth is the difference between the value of the assets of a firm and the value of debt. So what does that imply? It implies that the equity holder has a residual claim on the asset, but only after that the debt has been completely repaid to the creditors. So this means that the equity holders have an ownership right on the assets of the firm, but only for the net part, so only on that part that represents the difference between the value of the asset and the value of the debt. And this happens because clearly, as we were discussing before, the creditors have a preference on liquidation. So if we want to liquidate the assets of the firm, first we have to pay back the creditors, and once that we have paid back the creditors, the cash that will be residual after this operation can be accrued to the equity holder. So that's why there is a claim on net worth. Why is it important for the next issues to understand the difference between debt and equity? As we are saying at the beginning of this class, when you're funding a project, you can decide between debt and equity. So now the decision between debt and equity is not a random one, but should be motivated. And what emerges from this table is that on average, debt is less risky than equity, and debt is less risky than equity for a set of reasons. First of all, because the service is determined. Second, because there is a service preference. Third, because there is a mandatory redemption. Fourth, because there is a liquidation preference. So the principal and the return of the creditors is much more guaranteed and less risky than the investment made by an equity holder. So what is the implication of that? The implication is that typically the return on debt, that is the expected rate of return of the creditors, is lower than the return that instead equity holders are expecting from the project, because their risk is higher. And moreover, their risk is higher because their return is uncertain, because they will depend on profits, whereas the interest rate will not depend on profit. So what we have to have in mind at the moment is that when we are using equity as a source of financing, equity is more risky than debt, and so we'll have higher cost. So this will be a parameter that will have to drive the way we'll assemble our project finance structure, and will have to be a driver because will tell us something about the cost of capital. That, by the way, is exactly the next issue that we'll deal in the following class. So at this point, the class has ended, and I will I remember you that in order to get additional materials on the issues analyzed in this class, you can go to the website of the course and download the materials that are available in that case. So thank you, and see you next class.